August 13, 1944. General Dwight D. Eisenhower faces a decision that will define Allied hegemony for the next century. As Omar Bradley halts George Patton's Third Army and Bernard Montgomery's jaws fail to snap shut, a window of escape opens for the Wehrmacht. Why did the Supreme Commander choose internal stability over total victory? The answer remains buried in declassified cables and a silent struggle for command. The summer heat of 1944 did more than bake the hedgerows of Normandy. It incinerated the last vestiges of the Old World's military dominance. Following the explosive success of Operation Cobra, the Allied forces found themselves in a position that no strategist in London or Washington had dared to dream of during the dark days of 1940. The German 7th Army and the 5th Panzer Army were not merely retreating, they were being funneled into a geographic noose. This was the Falaise Pocket, a valley of death that promised the end of the war in the West, if only the Allies could muster the political will to close the gap. Primary sources from the Shayef declassified archives reveal a command structure vibrating with friction. On one side stood Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, the hero of El Alamein, a man whose operational brilliance was often overshadowed by a rigid adherence to the plan and a perceived condescension toward his American counterparts. On the other side was General Omar Bradley, the soldier's general, whose cautious, methodical approach to warfare was beginning to clash with the aggressive, almost reckless momentum of George S. Patton. Hovering above them all was Dwight D. Eisenhower, a man whose primary weapon was not the tank or the heavy bomber, but the art of the coalition. The tactical situation was as follows. The British and Canadians were pushing south from Caen toward Falaise, while the Americans, having shattered the German left flank, were racing north from Argentan. The distance between the two forces was a mere 18 miles. Within that gap sat nearly 100,000 German soldiers, hundreds of Tiger and Panther tanks, and the remains of the Nazi administrative machine in France. To the men on the ground, the objective was clear. To the men in the map rooms, the situation was fraught with a different kind of danger. As Patton's 15th Corps reached the outskirts of Argentan, the blood and guts general sensed the kill. He famously signaled Bradley, requesting permission to drive the British into the sea for another Dunkirk. It was a characteristic piece of Patton bravado, but it contained a kernel of tactical truth. The German retreat was a chaotic mass of horse-drawn carts and elite armored units, all bottlenecked on narrow roads under the relentless gaze of Allied fighter bombers. The encirclement was nearly complete. Then the order came down that would echo through history as one of the most controversial decisions of the Second World War. General Omar Bradley ordered the 15th Corps to halt. He forbade Patton from crossing the Army group boundary into Montgomery's sector. The gap remained open. Historians have long debated the official reason, the fear of friendly fire incidents as two massive armies converged head-on in a narrow corridor. However, internal memos between Bradley and Eisenhower suggest a far more complex set of motivations rooted in the fragile ego of the Allied command. Bradley's caution was not merely tactical, it was political. He was acutely aware that the British were struggling to meet their objectives at Falaise. For the Americans to overstep their boundaries and seize the prize originally assigned to Montgomery would have been a humiliating blow to British prestige. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, understood that the post-war world was being built in the mud of Normandy. To alienate Montgomery at this critical juncture would risk fracturing the very alliance needed to cross the Rhine. While the generals debated boundaries, the German commanders, including Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge and the resolute Paul Hauser, realized they were in a trap. Declassified intercepts from the Ultra program show that the German high command was in a state of absolute panic. Hitler, isolated in his wolf's lair, demanded a counterattack at Marton, Operation Luttich. It was a suicide mission. The German forces were being ordered to drive deeper into the pocket at the exact moment they should have been fleeing for the Seine. The American 90th and 80th Infantry Divisions stood ready at Argentan, watching the roads fill with the retreating enemy. The sheer volume of targets was overwhelming. Artillery units reported that they were literally running out of barrels because of the heat generated by constant firing. Yet the infantry remained stationary. The declassified daily war diaries of the 358th Infantry Regiment described the frustration of soldiers who could see the enemy through their binoculars but were forbidden from closing the distance. Across the gap, the Canadians in the 1st Polish Armored Division were fighting a desperate battle to reach the town of Falaise. The Poles in particular fought with a ferocity born of 4 years of national trauma. Their mission was to hold the high ground, specifically Hill 262, known as the Mace. They were the northern jaw of the trap, and they were waiting for the southern jaw to snap shut. But the southern jaw, controlled by Bradley and sanctioned by Eisenhower, remained locked in place at Argentan. The friction between Bradley and Montgomery was not just a matter of personality, it was a clash of military philosophies. Montgomery believed in the set-piece battle, where every unit moved in a choreographed sequence. Bradley, influenced by the American industrial approach to war, prioritized the preservation of his force and the clarity of his command lines. Eisenhower's siding with Bradley was a silent acknowledgement that the American contribution, both in manpower and materiel, now dictated the terms of the engagement. In the declassified eyes-only cables sent to George Marshall in Washington, Eisenhower justified the halt by citing the risk of a calamity if the two Allied forces collided. He argued that a solid shoulder was better than a broken encirclement, but this logic ignored the fact that every hour the gap remained open, hundreds of German officers, the backbone of the future defense of the Siegfried Line, were slipping away. The air war over the Falaise Pocket provided a glimpse into the carnage that Bradley feared. RAF Typhoons and USAAF 47 Thunderbolts turned the narrow roads into a charnel house. The declassified after-action reports from the 2nd Tactical Air Force described scenes of unprecedented slaughter. Pilots reported that the stench of death was so strong it could be smelled inside their cockpits at 1,000 feet. This was the killing ground, and yet the ground forces remained divided. We must look at the short encirclement versus the long encirclement debate. Montgomery had argued for a wide sweep toward the Seine to trap the entire German army in France. Bradley, fearing his overextended supply lines, opted for the short trap at Falaise. Eisenhower, caught between the two, chose the path of least resistance. He chose to maintain the integrity of the American command over the potential total destruction of the German 7th Army. By August 15th, the tension reached a breaking point. Patton was furious, reportedly telling his staff that Bradley was too careful to be great. The declassified memoirs of Patton's aides describe a command trailer filled with cigarette smoke and whispered curses. Patton knew that the window was closing. The Germans were no longer just retreating. They were fighting with the desperation of cornered animals, and they were finding the seams in the Allied lines. This was the moment when Allied hegemony was cemented, not through a glorious charge, but through a calculated decision to prioritize the hierarchy of the coalition over the immediate tactical opportunity. Eisenhower's refusal to overrule Bradley was the final signal that the British would no longer dictate the pace of the war. The soldiers' general had won the ear of the supreme commander, and the cost would be measured in the thousands of German soldiers who lived to fight another day. As the sun rose on August 16, 1944, the gap between Argentan and Falaise had narrowed to a mere few miles, yet it remained a sieve through which the lifeblood of the Wehrmacht continued to leak. The 1st Polish Armored Division, positioned on the ridges of Hill 262, looked down into a valley obscured by the smoke of burning Tiger tanks and the dust of 10,000 retreating boots. They were the lonely cork in a very large bottle, and they were about to be hit by a tidal wave of desperation. Declassified reports from the Polish 1st Armored indicate that they were cut off, surrounded by retreating German units who were more interested in survival than surrender. The Polish soldiers under General Stanislaw Mazek found themselves in a surreal position. They were the hunters who had become the hunted. They were holding the Mace with limited ammunition and no direct ground link to the American forces to the south. This was the direct consequence of the halt order. Had Bradley allowed Patton to advance those final 18 miles, the Poles would have been reinforced within hours. Inside the pocket, the scene was a descent into Dante's Inferno. The German 7th Army was no longer a military formation. It was a panicked mob. Primary source diaries from German Oberleutnants described the Thunderbolt terror. The Allied air superiority was so absolute that any movement during daylight hours was a death sentence. Soldiers abandoned their vehicles, killed their horses, and attempted to crawl through the woods toward the narrow exit at Chambois. The lack of Allied coordination on the ground meant that there was no stop line to prevent this infiltration. Dwight D. Eisenhower's role during these 48 hours was one of intense observation. From his forward command post, he received constant updates on the slaughter at the Gap. While he publicly supported Bradley, private letters to his wife Mamie hint at a man burdened by the weight of the carnage. He knew that the world would judge this decision. He was trading German lives for Allied cohesion. If he had forced Bradley to move and a massive friendly fire incident had occurred, the headlines in New York and London would have been disastrous for the alliance. By August 18th, the gap was finally being closed, but closed is a generous term. It was more of a gauntlet. The 90th U.S. Infantry Division and the 1st Polish Armored finally made contact at Chembois. The declassified photographs from this link-up do not show celebration. They show exhaustion. The roads were so choked with the carcasses of horses and men that the tanks had to use bulldozers to clear a path. The smell of decaying flesh, intensified by the August heat, was said to be detectable from miles away. Historians often point to the numbers: 50,000 Germans captured, 10,000 killed. But the number that haunts the archives is the 20,000 to 40,000 who escaped. Among them were the cadre of the 2nd SS Panzer Division and the 9th and 10th SS Panzer Divisions. These were the very units that would reorganize, refit, and strike back with terrifying force during the Battle of the Bulge just 4 months later. The decision to side with Bradley's caution at Falaise effectively bought the German army another 6 months of life. The political fallout was immediate but quiet. Montgomery was privately incensed, viewing the American halt as a failure of nerve. Bradley, conversely, felt he had saved his men from a chaotic meat grinder. Eisenhower, the master of the middle ground, let the dust settle. He understood that by allowing Bradley to have his way, he had solidified the American leadership's dominance. The shift of power was now complete. The United States was the senior partner, and its cautious, logistical approach to war would be the template for the remainder of the conflict. Let us consider the perspective of the German commander, Paul Hauser. Wounded in the jaw and being carried out of the pocket on the back of a tank, Hauser represented the resilience of the Prussian military tradition. He marveled at the hesitation of the Allied ground forces. From his perspective, the Americans had the door wide open and chose to stand at the threshold. This leadership dilemma on the Allied side gave the Wehrmacht the only thing it needed: time. The declassified cables between Eisenhower and Marshall in late August 1944 show a pivot in focus. The talk of total destruction of the enemy in the West was replaced by plans for the administration of liberated France. The Falaise Gap was treated as a victory, despite its tactical incompleteness. The narrative was being shaped in real time to emphasize the brilliance of the coalition, masking the deep-seated rivalries that had nearly allowed the entire German army to slip away. The human cost of this strategic friction was borne by the low-level soldiers. The declassified medical reports from the 12th Army Group show a spike in combat fatigue cases following the Falaise battle. It wasn't just the fighting, it was the horror of the aftermath. Clearing the killing ground was a task that broke the spirits of even the most hardened veterans. They were cleaning up the mess created by a map-room disagreement. What if Eisenhower had sided with Montgomery? What if he had ordered a long encirclement to the Seine? The declassified logistical report suggests that the Allied supply lines were already at a breaking point. A wider sweep might have resulted in a fuel crisis that would have stalled the entire front in September, potentially leading to an even worse stalemate. This was the alternate reality that Eisenhower feared most: a complete collapse of the Allied logistical tail. Ultimately, the Argentan and Falaise Gap was the laboratory where the post-war world was forged. The decision reflected a new reality. The Americans were no longer the junior partners who needed British guidance. Eisenhower's support of Bradley was an assertion of American strategic autonomy. It proved that the U.S. would fight the war on its own terms, prioritizing force protection and command stability over the risky, high-stakes maneuvers favored by the British Old Guard. As the Allied armies crossed the Seine and raced toward Paris, the ghosts of Falaise followed them. The elite German units that escaped would form the fire brigades that contested every river crossing and every forest for the next 9 months. The declassified intelligence summaries from late 1944 acknowledged that the failure to cork the bottle at Falaise significantly increased the difficulty of the autumn campaign in the Rhineland. The declassified daily unit war diaries of the 1st Polish Armored Division conclude their August entries with a somber note. They had held the mace, they had watched the enemy flee, and they had seen the bodies of their comrades piled high. They felt forgotten by the great men in their command trailers. Their sacrifice was the price paid for a diplomatic solution to a military problem. In the final analysis, Eisenhower's decision was not a failure of character, but a masterpiece of coalition management. He understood that the war was already won. It was now a matter of how the peace would be managed. By siding with Bradley, he ensured that the American military machine remained a unified, coherent force, ready to dominate the post-war landscape. The friction at the gap was merely the heat generated by the birth of a new superpower. History often remembers the maps and the arrows, the brilliant flanking maneuvers and the heroic stands. But the true story of the Falaise Gap lies in the silence between the commands, the cables that were never sent, and the deliberate decision to let a defeated enemy escape in order to keep an alliance together. It was a moment of profound ambiguity, a leadership dilemma that reveals the true, cold heart of high command in the 20th century. If you were in Eisenhower's position, would you have risked a friendly fire catastrophe to ensure the total destruction of the German army? Or was maintaining the alliance's political stability the more important victory? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell.